September 27th, 1941. Baltimore, Maryland, Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard. A brass band is playing on a wooden platform draped in bunting, and several thousand shipyard workers are standing in the sun in their coveralls, looking up at a steel hull that towers over the crowd like a grey cliff. President Franklin Roosevelt is at the microphone, and he's about to say something that makes half the crowd laugh. He calls the ship in front of them an ugly duckling. It's a fair description. The hull is boxy, slab-sided, riveted and welded together in a shape that no naval architect would ever call elegant. Somewhere out in the Atlantic that same week, a different kind of ship is hunting, quiet and unseen below the surface, and the men who command those ships already believe they know exactly how this story ends. Nobody standing on that platform in Baltimore yet understands that the ugliest ship in the American fleet is about to become the reason the ocean itself stops being a weapon Germany can win with. For most of naval history, the assumption had been simple. A cargo ship survives a war zone by being fast, or by being armed, or by being clever in its evasive routing. Speed mattered, because a faster ship could outrun a slower submarine on the surface, and sophistication mattered, because a well-engineered hull with skilled riveters and years of institutional shipyard knowledge behind it was what separated a navy that could fight a long war from one that couldn't. Germany's submarine force operated on a related piece of conventional wisdom, one championed by Admiral Karl Dönitz. You don't need to defeat America's navy, you only need to sink merchant tonnage faster than the Allies can replace it. In 1942 alone, U-boats sent more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. That number was real, and for a while it was true that no shipbuilding nation on Earth had ever replaced losses at anything close to that rate. Dönitz was right about the small thing. He was right that his crews could sink ships faster than any shipyard in history had ever built them. What he had no way of anticipating was that the entire premise of any shipyard in history was about to become irrelevant, because the men building America's new cargo fleet had almost no shipbuilding history at all. That's really where this story has to begin, with a strange irony. The man who would end up building more ships than anyone in American history didn't come from ships. Henry Kaiser was a construction magnate. He'd built roads in the Pacific Northwest, then poured concrete for the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, projects where the entire philosophy was to break enormous jobs into standardized, repeatable, parallel tasks that small armies of workers could execute without decades of specialized training. When Kaiser and a group of partners, operating as the 6 companies and later under contracts tied to the British Ministry of Shipping, were asked to help build cargo ships to a modified British ocean-class tramp steamer design, traditional shipbuilders on the East Coast were skeptical, and not without reason. Kaiser had never launched a ship in his life. His new yards, including the Richmond, California facility run by his shipyard manager Clay Bedford, had no deep bench of riveters or shipwrights who'd spent a lifetime learning the trade. On paper, that looked like exactly the kind of weakness that gets a war effort killed. It would turn out to be the opposite. Traditional shipbuilding in 1940 was slow because it was sequential and it was skilled. A ship's keel went down, and then, piece by piece, riveters worked their way up and around a hull that existed in only one place at one time, driving what could be 3 million rivets into a single vessel by hand, a process that could take the better part of a year and required men who'd apprenticed for that exact job. Early Liberty shipyards on the East Coast, even experienced ones, were struggling to build a single vessel in anything under 7 or 8 months, and the United States needed hundreds of these ships immediately, replacing tonnage that was disappearing into the Atlantic on a weekly basis. The early going wasn't smooth. Yards on both coasts wrestled with material shortages, with steel plate arriving late from mills that were also trying to supply tanks and aircraft, and with subcontractors scattered across the country who had never coordinated a project of this size before. Some of the first hulls sat half-finished for weeks, waiting on parts that a single, centralized, traditional shipyard would simply have kept in its own warehouse. Labour was an even bigger problem, and it only got worse as the war went on. Skilled riveters were scarce to begin with, and as men left for the armed forces, shipyards were filling their ranks with workers who had never built anything more complicated than a house frame. Farmers, clerks, teenagers straight out of high school, and, in growing numbers, women, many of whom would become known across the yards simply as Wendy the Welder. Union shipbuilders on the East Coast sometimes viewed the whole approach with open suspicion. A 6-week welding course was, in the old apprenticeship logic, not nearly enough to trust with a load-bearing seam on an ocean-going hull. A production method built around decades of specialized apprenticeship couldn't scale to an army of 6-week trained welders, and everyone involved knew that if the old method didn't bend, the ships simply wouldn't get built in time. Something had to give, and what gave was the entire model of how a ship gets built. Kaiser's yards, having no shipbuilding tradition to protect, treated a Liberty ship the way Kaiser had treated a dam, as a giant assembly problem that could be broken into modular, prefabricated pieces built simultaneously in different locations, then hoisted and welded together at the shipway instead of built there from scratch. Deck houses were assembled complete, with plumbing and wiring already installed in nearby fabrication sheds. Entire hull sections, some weighing well over 200 tons, were welded together on assembly platforms away from the ship itself, then carried by enormous travelling cranes and lowered into place like sections of a jigsaw puzzle finally meeting their edges. Welding, rather than riveting, fused these massive sections together in continuous seams that a crew with a few weeks of training could learn to run, instead of the years it took to master a rivet gun. The ship stopped being built in one place over one long, unbroken timeline and became something closer to a car on Henry Ford's assembly line, except the assembly line was the size of a city block, and the product was 14,000 tons of steel. Picture the floor of the Richmond yard on an ordinary shift. On one side of the yard, a crew is welding a bow section that will never touch water for another 2 weeks. On another platform, a deck house is going up complete with its ladders and portholes, looking almost like a small building rather than part of a ship. Overhead, whistling cranes rated to lift well over 100 tons are swinging finished sections across the yard on rails, lowering them into position over the keel with inches to spare, while welding crews standing on scaffolding fuse the seams together in showers of sparks that light up the fog rolling in off the bay. None of these workers needs to know how to build an entire ship. Each one only needs to know how to do one repeatable task extremely well, and do it again on the next hull and the one after that. The clearest proof of what this method could do came in November of 1942 at Kaiser's Permanente Metals Yard in Richmond, California, in an event that was frankly staged as a publicity stunt, but a stunt built on a method that was already real. Clay Bedford's yard had spent weeks pre-staging every prefabricated section of a Liberty ship named the SS Robert E. Peary, timing cranes, welding crews, and outfitting teams down to the shift. The keel was laid on November 8th. 4 days, 15 hours and 26 minutes later, the Robert E. Peary slid down the ways and into San Francisco Bay, launched, riveted where it needed to be, welded everywhere else with its engine and much of its outfitting still to be finished afloat over the following days. It was an exaggerated case, not a representative one, and everyone at Kaiser's yard knew it. But it proved the ceiling of the method in a way no chart could. Average Liberty ship construction time, which had run close to 230 days in the program's first year, fell to somewhere around 42 days by 1943 across the fleet, and the man-hours needed to build a single ship dropped from roughly 600,000 towards something closer to 200,000. The method wasn't free of cost, and the war effort found that out at a dock in Portland, Oregon, in January of 1943, when the SS Schenectady, freshly built and undergoing sea trials, suddenly split most of the way across her deck and hull, with a sound witnesses described as a gunshot, while tied up and in calm water. It wasn't an isolated case. Several Liberty ships suffered brittle hull fractures in cold weather, and one, the SS John P. Gaines, actually broke in two at sea in November 1943, with loss of life. Investigators, including the British metallurgist Constance Tipper, traced the cause to the very thing that made the ships fast to build: continuous welded seams, unlike riveted joints, gave a crack nowhere to stop once it started, and certain steel used in the hulls turned brittle in cold Atlantic temperatures. The fix wasn't a redesign of the whole program, it was a set of precise corrections. Riveted crack arrestor strips at key points along the hull and deck, rounded hatch corners in place of stress-concentrating square ones, and tougher steel specifications for cold water routes. The flaw was addressed without slowing the production method down, and the ships kept coming. By the time the war ended, American yards had built more than 2,600 Liberty ships, an output that no combatant nation had ever approached for a single class of vessel, built at a pace that, by mid-1943, was finally outrunning the rate at which U-boats could sink them. Dönitz's tonnage war depended on an equation where German crews could always sink faster than America could build. Once that equation flipped, in the middle of 1943, the maximum sinking rate the U-boat fleet was capable of no longer mattered, because it was simply outproduced. German naval planners, who had built their entire Atlantic strategy around a shipbuilding ceiling that no one had ever broken before, found themselves fighting a numbers game they could no longer win, regardless of how many convoys their submarines still managed to find. The prefabrication method that started in California and Oregon spread to yards on the Gulf Coast and the eastern seaboard as well, with more than a dozen shipyards eventually turning out Liberty ships on some version of the same modular approach, each one adapting the same basic idea of building the ship in pieces before it ever became one continuous hull. The SS Patrick Henry, the ship Roosevelt stood in front of in Baltimore, went on to make more than a dozen wartime voyages across the Atlantic and later in the Pacific, hauling exactly the kind of unglamorous cargo the whole class had been built for, and survived the war entirely, still there to be sold off and eventually scrapped years later in 1958. The ugly duckling, as Roosevelt had called it that day in Baltimore, turned out to be precisely as durable and precisely as decisive as the name half-jokingly promised. What the Liberty ship program really shows isn't a story about welding versus rivets, or even about one industrialist's stubborn confidence. It's a reminder that in a war of production, the ship that wins isn't always the one built best. It's the one that can be built again, and again, faster than the enemy can destroy it. Sometimes the deciding weapon in a war isn't the fastest hull or the most sophisticated design at all. It's the one nobody was afraid to build ugly and build 1,000 times over.